He wanted to be remembered as an artist. Instead, he became a monster. Nero painted his stage with blood, executions, crucifixions, fires that swallowed entire districts. And when the crowd turned against their performer, he didn't fight. He vanished into darkness, into madness, and finally into a lonely death that no soldier, no senator, and no soul was willing to witness. This is the real end of Nero, the boy who wanted applause and died in silence. The air in Rome was thick with tension, a palpable unease that seeped into the hearts of its people. Once they had adored him. Nero, the golden boy, the emperor with the voice of an angel, the one who would lead Rome into a new age of glory. But now his reign had become a shadow. Whispers of rebellion spread like wildfire, stoking fears among the people. The streets, once filled with cheers of admiration, now echoed with murmurs of disdain. Nero sat in his imperial palace, his fingers twitching restlessly over the strings of his lyre. Music had once been his refuge, but now it felt hollow. It was a beautiful facade, like the golden statues of him that adorned the city, but underneath, the empire was rotting. Senators plotted in the shadows. Generals whispered of betrayal. The people, once loyal, were no longer content with adulation. They demanded justice, and the whispers were growing louder. But Nero wasn't listening to them. He had built his empire on power and blood. When his stepbrother was murdered, it had been necessary. When his mother, Agrippina, became a threat to his rule, she too had to be silenced. But the cost was more than he realized. Now, even the blood on his hands couldn't stop the cracks from forming. Fear had replaced admiration. But Nero, ever the performer, was determined to keep his crown, even as it grew heavier with each passing day. The fire inside him would never burn out, or so he thought. But fear alone won't save him. What happens when a king grows desperate for control? When power slips through his fingers like sand? Nero's empire was built on blood, but could he hold it together long enough to keep his throne? Nero's rise to power had been swift, his youth marked by lavish celebrations and performances. As a child, he had been surrounded by luxury, his palace filled with tutors, musicians, and philosophers. But deep down, there was always a hunger for more. The world, it seemed, owed him everything. It wasn't enough to merely be emperor. He had to be adored, revered like a god. To him, the throne was not just a symbol of power, it was a stage. From the start, Nero's cruelty had been masked by his charm. His youth had won him allies in the Senate and among the people, but they couldn't see the beast lurking behind his golden exterior. He began to see every life as a tool for his ambitions, every ally, every friend, a stepping stone to something greater. His first taste of blood came early. In his desperation to solidify his rule, he ordered the death of his stepbrother, Britannicus. It was swift, and it was necessary. At least, that's what he told himself. But the bloodshed didn't stop there. When his mother, Agrippina, grew too powerful for his comfort, Nero had her murdered too. Her blood, spilled by his own hand, stained his conscience, but he convinced himself it was the only way to preserve his reign. The city of Rome, once a symbol of his golden empire, had begun to show signs of rot. Beneath the marble columns and grand statues, Nero's rule was slipping into chaos. Despite this, Nero played his part. He performed in front of crowds, charming them with his music, his acting, his art. Rome saw a king who loved them, a ruler who shared in their joy. But it was all a performance. Behind the scenes, he was ruthless, even as he tried to maintain the facade of an enlightened ruler. The opulence, the festivals, the public works, they were all distractions, a way to keep the people entertained, even as he buried his empire in blood. But even a king obsessed with beauty can't escape the ugly truth. As Rome burns, Nero's obsession with perfection will push him beyond the limits of reason, and the flames of his madness will ignite an entire empire. The fire is only just beginning. The night of July 18th, 64 AD, would mark the beginning of the end for Nero. The flames started in the southeast of Rome, small and unassuming at first. But within hours, the fire spread like a living thing, engulfing the city's wooden buildings, eating through its streets, and leaving nothing but ash in its wake. For 6 days, the fire raged uncontrollably, devouring everything that had once stood as a testament to Rome's grandeur. Nero, as the flames licked the walls of his empire, did not appear concerned. In fact, he did something that would echo through history. He took to his palace and, according to some reports, began to sing. Dressed in theatrical robes, he played his lyre, watching as the city he ruled was reduced to rubble. The rumors of him fiddling while Rome burned would persist for centuries, painting him as a heartless emperor who cared only for his own indulgence. As the fire spread, so did the whispers. The people of Rome, once loyal and adoring, began to question their ruler. How could Nero, who had promised prosperity, stand by and do nothing as the heart of Rome burned to the ground? Was he truly the emperor they had crowned, or had he lost touch with reality entirely? Nero, ever the performer, knew the power of public perception. He had already begun to lay the groundwork for his defense. It wasn't his fault, he claimed. In his eyes, the Christians were to blame. He needed a scapegoat to divert suspicion from himself, and so he blamed the very people who had become the target of his cruelty. Nero ordered their arrest, torture, and brutal executions. Some were set alight to burn as human torches, others thrown to the wild beasts in the arena. The emperor's need to preserve his image outweighed any moral considerations. The fire, in his mind, was a way to reignite Rome, to rebuild it in his image. But that was a lie, a deception that would unravel as the flames died out. The public, once enamored by Nero's charisma and lavish performances, began to feel the heat of his cruelty. The Senate, once an ally, now murmured in the shadows. Senators who had once praised Nero for his youth and vision now saw him as a tyrant, someone who would stop at nothing to secure his power. The empire was buckling under the weight of his reign, and yet Nero refused to stop his performance. The fire was merely the beginning of his madness. With each passing day, the emperor's obsession with perfection grew. In the aftermath of the Inferno, while much of Rome lay in ruins, Nero used the destruction to rebuild, not just the city, but his own image. He ordered the construction of an extravagant new palace, the Domus Aurea, a place of unimaginable luxury. Rome, however, had begun to see Nero for who he truly was. No longer the golden boy, but a man consumed by ambition, cruelty, and an insatiable hunger for control. The fire had not just scorched the city, it had burned away the last remnants of the empire's loyalty to its emperor. But while Nero plays his fiddle, the blood of his empire stains his hands. As the city smolders, something even darker stirs. Beneath the ashes, who can survive the fire, and who will burn with it? Nero's cruelty, like the flames that had once consumed Rome, was relentless. As the city began to rebuild from the ashes of the fire, it was clear that Nero had no intention of letting the wounds of the empire heal. Instead of showing mercy, he used the destruction as an opportunity to tighten his grip on power, to assert his dominance over every facet of Rome. But the emperor's lust for control was insatiable. He wasn't just concerned with ruling the empire, he wanted to be worshipped as a god. And to achieve this, he needed to remove any and all threats to his reign, no matter how close or beloved they were. It was in this atmosphere of paranoia and brutality that the full scope of Nero's madness began to unfold. The people of Rome had long been suspicious of Nero's power. The Senate had started to murmur, and whispers of rebellion spread in the dark corners of the city. Senators, who had once hailed him as the future of Rome, now saw him as a tyrant, a puppet emperor, controlled by his vices and his fears. Nero, ever the performer, had long considered himself above reproach, but the cracks in his reign were becoming impossible to ignore. It was during this time of growing unrest that Nero took the most drastic of actions. His own mother, Agrippina, who had once been his greatest supporter, became a symbol of the old ways, of a time before Nero had tasted absolute power. As Nero's paranoia deepened, he came to see his mother as a threat, someone whose influence over him still lingered in the shadows. It was time to eliminate that threat once and for all. Agrippina's death was not a simple affair. Nero had orchestrated it with the precision of a man who had learned the art of murder early in life. At first, he tried to poison her, but when the poison failed, he resorted to more direct measures. The plan to have Agrippina killed was shrouded in deceit, with Nero hiding behind false facades of loyalty and concern. He had her ambushed in her villa, where she was brutally murdered, her body dumped unceremoniously, like the discarded remnants of an empire that had once supported him. The death of his mother sent shockwaves through Rome. But for Nero, it was a necessary sacrifice. He believed that with her gone, he would be free from the influence of the past, free to reshape Rome in his own image. What he failed to realize was that the blood he had spilled would only serve to fuel the growing hatred within his people. As Agrippina's blood soaked the palace floors, Nero's own rule began to unravel. The people were no longer fooled by his performances or his empty promises. They saw him for what he was, a man consumed by his own madness, a ruler who would stop at nothing to maintain his grip on power. Nero had transformed the empire into a garden of blood, where his own family, his closest allies, and even the citizens of Rome could be sacrificed for his ambition. But Nero's bloodlust wasn't limited to his family alone. He sought to stamp out anyone who dared oppose him, using executions, imprisonments, and public tortures to silence his enemies. The Colosseum, once a symbol of Roman might, became a place for Nero to display his power. Christians, whom he blamed for the fire, were crucified and burned alive as human torches to light his gardens. They died for a crime they didn't commit, their screams echoing through the night. The empire had become a place of fear, where no one was safe, not even the gods. Nero's cruelty had become legendary, and his grip on the throne was more fragile than ever. His empire had begun to suffocate under the weight of his own terror. Nero's reign of terror isn't enough to protect him from the cracks spreading within his empire. With every drop of blood spilled, his allies begin to vanish. The Senate is turning, and Nero will soon learn that even the gods have their limits. Nero's rule had been built on terror, and terror was what he had come to rely on most. But in the shadows of his empire, whispers began to grow louder, whispers that spoke of rebellion, of disloyalty, of betrayal. As the flames of the fire had torn through Rome, so too had the loyalty of his allies begun to crumble one by one. The Senate, once a symbol of Roman power, had begun to see Nero not as a ruler to be admired, but as a tyrant to be feared. His reign of bloodshed, his growing madness, and his endless indulgence had eroded their trust. Once, Nero had been a member of the Julio-Claudian family, a symbol of Rome's golden future. Now, he was a symbol of its decay. The Senate had quietly begun to plot against him, sensing that his days were numbered. Senators who had once whispered his praises now murmured of his faults in dark corners of the city. They spoke of his cruelty, his decadence, his obsession with theater and art over the governance of an empire in crisis. In their eyes, Nero was no longer the golden boy. He was a madman who had outlived his usefulness, and as the empire began to fracture, Nero saw only his reflection in the chaos. His paranoia grew. He believed that the Senate's betrayal was inevitable, that everyone around him was plotting against him. His fear pushed him to make even more desperate decisions. The imperial court became a den of whispers, with conspiracies and betrayals spinning webs around him. Trusted advisors were replaced with yes-men, and those who dared question his rule found themselves swiftly removed, often in the most gruesome of ways. But even as Nero consolidated his power with ever more brutal measures, the cracks in his reign deepened. The people who once cheered his name were no longer content to remain silent. They were starving, suffering under oppressive taxes, and fearing for their lives as Nero's cruelty escalated. The golden age he had promised was no more. His lavish festivals and extravagant performances in the arena no longer masked the rot beneath. At the heart of the Senate's growing discontent were the generals, men who had once fought in Nero's name but had begun to question his leadership. The military, after all, was the backbone of the empire, and its loyalty to the emperor was essential for his survival. But the generals were no longer loyal to Nero. They had seen his weakness. They had seen how easily he had turned on those closest to him, how his paranoia had made him cruel even to his own family. They had begun to conspire, aligning themselves with Galba, a rival who had begun to gather an army to take Nero's throne. The Senate was divided. Some still believed in the emperor's potential, but most knew that the empire could not survive. Under Nero's rule, the question was no longer whether Nero could hold power, it was how long the empire would tolerate his madness before it toppled. His reign had become an untenable nightmare, and the Senate could feel the inevitability of his fall. Nero, however, was oblivious to the growing storm. He still believed in his divine right to rule, convinced that his music, his performances, and his extravagant lifestyle could keep the people enthralled. But as the whispers turned into open mutiny, he realized too late that the empire he had once ruled with grandeur was slipping through his fingers. But it's not just his enemies he fears. His darkest secrets are rising from the depths of his past, secrets that will haunt him and bring his empire to its knees. Can the emperor who killed his own mother escape his greatest fear? As the empire began to turn against him, Nero retreated further into the walls of his gilded palace. But no matter how many layers of marble and gold he surrounded himself with, he could not escape the suffocating weight of his own conscience. The echoes of his past haunted him in the most chilling of ways, for it was not the Senate, nor his soldiers, nor the whispers of revolt that plagued his mind. It was the ghost of his mother, Agrippina. Nero had once been devoted to his mother. Agrippina had guided his rise to power, manipulating the empire's politics to ensure her son would sit on the throne. But as his rule became more assured, Nero began to see her as a threat, someone who could still control him, someone who still had the power to influence Rome. In a moment of cold, calculated ambition, he had ordered her death. The blood he had spilled that night could never be washed away. It was this blood, this irreversible decision, that began to unravel his sanity. In the darkness of his palace, alone with his thoughts, Nero saw Agrippina everywhere. Her eyes followed him from the mirrors, from the shadows of his chambers, from the halls where her voice had once echoed. He could not escape her, nor the guilt that now tore at his soul. The woman who had once controlled him now haunted him. A ghost he could never rid himself of. The mirrors became his prison. Everywhere he turned, there she was, her cold eyes staring back at him, reminding him of the treachery he had committed. His empire, once his to command, now felt like a tomb, a place where his guilt was a living, breathing thing. He could feel the weight of her blood on his hands, and in his fevered mind, she spoke to him, whispering words of condemnation. "You cannot escape me," she seemed to say. "You are just like your father." Nero's father had been an emperor who had ruled with cruelty, and though Nero had tried to deny it, the same darkness now consumed him. Agrippina's ghost was a mirror, reflecting not just her death, but the nature of his own reign. A reign built on blood and betrayal, and yet it was not just Agrippina who haunted him. There were other ghosts in the palace, friends who had once been loyal to him, family members who had been executed, and rivals whose screams echoed in his ears. The walls of his palace, which had once been symbols of his power, now felt like a cage, trapping him with his own demons. Every night as he lay in his bed, the faces of the dead swirled in his mind. He saw them in his dreams, and even when he was awake, they seemed to follow him, silent, accusing, waiting for him to acknowledge what he had done. The ghost of Agrippina was no longer just a figure of his imagination. It was a curse, a constant reminder that his rise to power had been stained by murder. As the empire he ruled slowly unraveled, he realized that the price of his crown was the soul he had sold to keep it. But the ghosts of the past are nothing compared to the silence of the present. The streets are empty, the statues defaced, and Nero realizes the empire he built is crumbling. He is no longer feared, he is a joke, but the real horror is yet to come. The streets of Rome had once echoed with chants of Nero's name, and his statues had been erected in every corner of the empire. The people had adored him as a god, his image immortalized in marble. He was the emperor, the shining star of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the golden boy who would lead Rome to a new era of glory. His rule was meant to be eternal, his name etched in history forever. But as Nero's empire began to unravel, the very statues that had once been erected in his honor now lay shattered, toppled by the hands of those who had once worshipped him. Rome, once a city of light and triumph, had become a hollow shell, a reflection of the man who now called it home. Nero walked the streets, but the crowds that had once cheered for him now turned their backs. His palace, once a beacon of opulence, had become a tomb of loneliness. The empty halls echoed with the sound of his footsteps, but there were no voices to cheer his name, no one to admire him, no one to worship him. The golden boy had become a shadow, a parody of the emperor he had once been. The people who had once seen him as a god now saw only a man consumed by fear and self-delusion. His performances, once celebrated, were now mocked. The lyre he once played so confidently had become a symbol of his arrogance, a tool of a ruler who cared more for the applause of the masses than the well-being of his empire. The emperor who had once charmed the world now found himself alone, his power slipping through his fingers like sand. Nero's paranoia had reached its peak. He saw conspiracies in every corner, betrayal in every face. His former allies, once loyal to the end, had abandoned him. The Senate, once his ally, had now turned against him. The generals who had fought for him were no longer willing to lay down their lives for a man who had become a symbol of failure. Even the people who had once adored him had begun to turn on him. The golden idol that had once been worshipped was now a forgotten relic, a symbol of the decay that had consumed the empire. In the silence of his palace, Nero realized the truth. He was no longer feared. He was no longer loved. He was no longer even respected. His reign had been a failure, and all that was left for him was the emptiness of his own reflection. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The streets of Rome had once called his name, but now they were empty. Nero had wanted to be remembered as a god, but instead he had become a joke. A once great emperor, reduced to a figure of ridicule. His name had been erased from the hearts of his people, and his legacy was nothing more than a tale of madness, cruelty, and ambition gone awry. But even as his empire fell, Nero refused to give up his crown. He refused to acknowledge the truth of his downfall. His vanity, his need to be remembered, was all that kept him going. He would not die as a failure. He would not die as a man who had lost everything. In his mind, he was still the god-king of Rome, but Rome had already forgotten him. The empire that once worshipped him now wants his blood. The emperor who danced for his people now finds no one left to applaud. His reign has ended, not with a roar, but with a whisper. Can he still hold on to power when the people have turned their backs? As Nero gazed out over the city of Rome from his palace, the realization began to sink in. The empire he had once ruled with grandeur was slipping through his fingers. The streets that had once been filled with loyal subjects now seemed empty, their voices no longer raised in praise of their emperor. Instead, the winds of revolt were stirring. The walls of his golden palace, which had once been a sanctuary of power, now felt like a prison, confining him within the very empire he had torn apart. The Senate, once a place of allegiance, had now become a breeding ground for conspiracies. The whispers had grown louder, louder than the cheers of the crowds who had once adored him. Senators who had once sat at his side, praising his name, were now plotting his downfall. Their loyalty had turned to ashes, swept away by the flames of his own cruelty. It was no longer a matter of if Nero would fall, but when. And as the Senate grew bolder, they knew their time had come. But it wasn't just the Senate that was turning against him. The military, the backbone of his rule, had begun to crumble as well. His generals, once steadfast in their loyalty, had grown disillusioned by Nero's madness. The cracks within the military were wide, and there were murmurs of defection, of soldiers who would no longer fight for a ruler they no longer respected. The Praetorian Guard, once his most trusted force, had grown silent, and their loyalty had begun to waver. The loyalty of the very men who had sworn to protect him was fading into the wind. At the heart of this fracture was the rise of Galba, a general who had once been loyal to Nero, but now found himself rallying support among the Senate and the military. Galba had begun to gain the trust of the very men who had once fought for Nero. His army was swelling, and with each passing day, it seemed more likely that Nero's empire would crumble beneath the weight of its own betrayal. And so, as his empire turned its back on him, Nero retreated further into his own delusions. He clung to the idea that he was invincible, that he could somehow restore order with his charm, his performances, his art. He still believed that he was the golden boy, the emperor destined for greatness. But the reality was clear. Nero's reign was coming to an end, and the empire he had built on blood and spectacle would soon come crashing down. As the flames of rebellion grew higher, Nero found himself isolated. The walls of his palace were no longer a sanctuary, but a reminder of his failure. The Senate had declared him an enemy of the state, and Galba's forces were marching toward Rome. Nero's once grand empire was now nothing more than a crumbling facade, held together by the fragile threads of his vanity and his fear. The once great emperor had become a fugitive in his own city, a prisoner of his own creation. His name, once celebrated, was now cursed. His empire, once revered, was now a symbol of decay. And all that remained for Nero was the crushing weight of his own downfall, a fate sealed by his own cruelty, his own madness, and the very people who had once raised him to the heights of power. The walls of Rome are closing in. The streets, once paved with triumph, are now filled with curses. With no one to trust and nowhere to run, Nero faces a choice. Will he flee like a coward, or will he face the wrath of the empire he's torn apart? The night air was thick with the stench of fear. Nero's empire had crumbled, his enemies closing in from all sides. The once mighty emperor, who had once reveled in the adoration of the Roman people, was now a fugitive in his own city. The golden palaces he had once inhabited now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the grim reality of hiding in the shadows, fleeing from the very empire he had built. Nero's mind, once sharp and confident, had begun to fracture under the weight of his downfall. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet, every whisper in the hallway sent his heart racing. The voices of his enemies seemed to echo through the walls, growing louder with each passing hour. The Senate had declared him an enemy of the state, and Galba's forces were marching toward the heart of Rome. Nero had once ruled with an iron fist, but now he found himself grasping at nothing but the fleeting remnants of his former power. His once loyal Praetorian Guard had defected. His allies had vanished. Those who remained were too afraid to stand by his side, knowing that their fates were now tied to a man who had become a symbol of failure. Even the streets of Rome, once filled with cheers and applause for their emperor, had turned cold. The people no longer feared him, they mocked him. They had witnessed the destruction of the empire he had promised to protect, and now they saw him for what he truly was, a man who had lost everything. Desperation clawed at Nero's chest as he slipped through the darkened streets of Rome, disguised in a tattered cloak. His golden armor, once a symbol of his power, had been replaced with the humble garb of a fugitive. His footsteps echoed through the empty streets, the only sound in a city that had once teemed with life. He moved quickly, but the weight of his own fear slowed him. Each shadow seemed to hold his enemies. Every alley could be a trap. Nero had once been the ruler of the known world. Now he was just a man running from the inevitable. He tried to seek refuge with those who had once been loyal to him, but his appeals fell on deaf ears. The senators, the generals, the soldiers, all had turned their backs. No one wanted to be associated with the fallen emperor. And as the hours passed, Nero realized that there was no one left who would help him. His empire was gone, his friends were traitors, and even his own mind seemed to betray him. The golden boy, once adored by the people, was now reduced to a desperate man, scurrying through the streets, his future as uncertain as the dark sky overhead. The silence of the night was broken only by the distant sounds of Galba's forces closing in. Nero's empire had been built on blood, and now it was ready to claim its final price. But even in the midst of his flight, Nero could not give up his delusions. He clung to the idea that somehow someone would come to save him, that his name would once again echo through the streets of Rome. But deep down, he knew the truth. No one was coming. His reign was over, and no amount of fleeing would change that. But a man who once ruled the world can't escape his destiny. His enemies are closing in, and his name is now a curse. As Nero runs for his life, the empire he destroyed is about to claim its final revenge, what awaits him in the shadows. The final days of Nero were nothing like the grand displays of power he had once put on for the people of Rome. His empire, once a symbol of might and glory, had collapsed around him like a house of cards. Nero, once the godlike emperor of Rome, was now a hunted man, alone and broken, fleeing through the streets that had once worshipped him. As the forces of Galba drew nearer, Nero's thoughts became a blur of fear and confusion. The golden boy who had once ruled with an iron fist now found himself stripped of everything he had once held dear: his power, his riches, his adoring followers. All that remained were the remnants of a shattered empire and the crushing weight of his own impending doom. His footsteps echoed through the darkened alleys as he made his way toward the outskirts of the city, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no escaping the inevitable. The empire had turned its back on him, and now his fate was sealed. But Nero, ever the performer, could not accept the truth. He still clung to the illusion that somehow someone might come to save him, that he might once again rise to power. But as the hours passed, that hope began to fade, leaving only the cold, oppressive reality of his situation. Nero's mind wandered back to the days of his youth, the lavish banquets, the adoring crowds, the sense of invincibility he had once felt as he sat atop the throne. But those days were gone, swept away by the blood he had spilled and the madness that had consumed him. He had murdered his own mother, poisoned his stepbrother, and executed countless others to secure his rule. And now, those very actions were coming back to haunt him. As Nero stumbled through the dark streets, his body weary and his mind unraveling, he found himself at the edge of the city, where his final escape awaited him. But there was no solace to be found in the shadows. He had nowhere to run, no refuge to take. His once mighty empire had betrayed him, and the world had turned against him. It was then, in the cold embrace of the night, that Nero made a choice. He could no longer hide from the consequences of his actions. His kingdom, once so grand, was now reduced to dust. His name, once shouted in admiration, had become a curse. And so, as the sound of Galba's forces grew closer, Nero took his final, trembling step toward the inevitable. With a dagger in his hand, Nero fell to his knees. The man who had once ruled the world, the emperor who had burned Rome to the ground, now faced his end in silence. Alone, abandoned and forgotten, Nero raised the dagger to his chest. His breath was shallow, his hands trembling, but there was no turning back. In his final moments, as the blood began to spill, Nero whispered the last words that would echo in history. "What an artist the world is losing in me." His body slumped, and with it, the last remnants of his empire fell away. The once great emperor, the god who had once commanded the world, was no more. His name was erased from the pages of history, his legacy destroyed by his own hand. And so, the emperor who once commanded the world died in silence. His name erased. His legacy nothing more than the echo of a man who thought he could burn it all down, only to be consumed by the flames.